I got a letter from Dad. We're giving the family home to David. I wasn't invited to the will reading. Months later they showed up at my door. You have to share your house with the family. My lawyer stepped forward and said, not anymore. I got a letter from Dad. We're giving the family home to David. I wasn't invited to the will reading. Months later, they showed up at my door. You have to share your house with the family. My lawyer stepped forward and said, not anymore. Thank you for being here with me today. I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. I'd love it if you could share in the comments which city or country you're watching from and what time it is there. Now let's begin our story together. There's a word for people like me. The ones who are born to fix things. We're the family glue, the emergency fund, the 2 a.m. phone call, the responsible ones for 35 years. That was my identity, my purpose. I was Mark the fixer and my older brother David was the one who was always broken. It had been that way since we were kids. He was the charming whirlwind storm. I was the quiet sturdy shelter. He'd break a window with a baseball and I'd be the one carefully explaining to Dad why it was an accident, taking half the blame just to soften the landing for him. Our parents saw it as a feature, not a bug in our family's operating system. David is so charming. He just needs the right break. My mother, Susan, would sigh, a wistful look in her eye. My father, Michael, a man whose silence was a language of its own, would just nod in agreement. Then they'd turn to me. Mark, you're so sensible. You'll always be fine. It wasn't a compliment, it was a life sentence. Being sensible meant that when I was 19, I forfeited a prestigious summer internship in Germany, a life-changing opportunity for a budding software engineer. David, at 22, had gotten into another crisis. This one involved a poker debt and some very unhappy people. I remember the smell of my mother's stress baking, cinnamon, and desperation filling our small house. My father paced the linoleum kitchen floor, his face etched with a familiar weary disappointment. They didn't ask me for the money I'd saved for my trip. They didn't have to. They just sat me down at the kitchen table, my mother's eyes shimmering with tears, and talked about how David's sensitive nature couldn't handle this kind of pressure. He made a mistake, my father mumbled, his gaze fixed on the floor. He's just not built for the world the way you are, Mark. So I gave them the money. I watched my dream evaporate in a Western Union transfer and in return, I got a pat on the shoulder and the suffocating comfort of knowing I had once again kept the family from capsizing. Years of this had a cumulative effect. It was a slow erosion of self. My ambitions were always secondary. My savings account, a slush fund for David's next spectacular failure. He drifted from one get-rich-quick scheme to another, leaving a trail of broken promises and angry investors. And through it all, I was the backstop, the family fixer. In my quiet moments, alone in my small apartment, I'd sometimes let the bitterness rise. How many right breaks does one person get? And why did my sensibility always mean my needs came last? But I'd always push it down. This was my duty. This was family. Then last year, something shifted after a grueling project at work. I received a bonus that was significant for the first time. I didn't see it as a buffer for David's next disaster. I saw a door, a small one, but a door just for me. For 3 months, I lived like a monk, coupling that bonus with every penny I had ever managed to squirrel away. And I did it. 35. I bought my own house. Not a mansion. Not even close. Just a modest 2-bedroom bungalow with a crooked porch and a backyard big enough for a dog I hadn't yet adopted. It was mine. Every shingle, every floorboard, paid for with my own sweat and my own deferred dreams. I drove to my parents' house, the deed feeling heavy and sacred in my glove compartment. I found them in the living room, the TV murmuring in the background. The air was thick with the scent of old memories and my father's pipe tobacco. Mom, Dad, I said, my voice tight with nervous pride. I have some news. I bought a house. My mother looked up from her knitting. Oh, she said, her voice flat. That's nice, dear. Just be careful with your money. My father just nodded, his eyes not leaving the television screen. David, who was lounging on the couch scrolling through his phone, let out a short, humorless laugh. Look at Mr. Big Shot, he said without looking up. Don't forget your little brother. The warmth in my chest turned to ice. There was no congratulations, no pride, just a warning and a sneer. It was as if my success was an inconvenience, a disruption to the established order where I was the provider, not a person with his own life. The real blow came 2 weeks later. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't a conversation. It was a single sheet of cheap copy paper in a standard business envelope. My father's spidery handwriting on the front. I opened it, my heart thudding a slow heavy rhythm against my ribs. It was a short brutally formal letter. It informed me that they had officially updated their will. The family home, the house I grew up in, the place where every height marking on the doorframe was mine was being left entirely to David. The letter's logic was a knife twist. David's sensitive nature means he needs the stability. My father had written, "And you've proven you can make your own way, Mark. We're so proud you don't need our help." The words "don't need our help" felt like a door slamming shut in my face. Not a compliment. My chest tightened as if someone had wrapped barbed wire around my lungs. My lungs ached. The air suddenly too thick to breathe. You don't get praised for being strong. You get punished for it. I stumbled back and sat on my new empty couch, the letter trembling in my hand. They hadn't just given David the house. They had used my own strength and sacrifice as the justification to erase me. I tried to call. Voicemail. I tried my mother's cell. Voicemail. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from David. "Heard about the house. Tough break, bro." The casual cruelty of it stole what little air I had left. The final insult, the one that truly severed the last frayed thread of my filial duty, came a month later. I learned through a cousin that there had been a will announcement, an informal family gathering to make the decision official. Uncle Joe, my father's brother, had been there. I had not been invited. "Your mom said it would just be too upsetting for you," my cousin told me over the phone, her voice laced with pity. "Joe said it was for the best, you know, since you've always been so independent." Independent. It wasn't a description, it was a dismissal. An exile. I was standing in the middle of my own living room, sunlight streaming through the windows of a house I had fought for, and I had never felt so homeless. I looked at the family photos on my phone, scrolling back through years of forced smiles and holidays, where I felt more like a guest than a son. It wasn't just about a house, it was an erasure. Like my entire life of contributions had been written in invisible ink. I confided in my best friend, Sarah. We'd met in college and she was the only one who had ever seen the full picture of my family dynamic. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment after I finished, and I could hear the sharp intake of her breath. "Mark," she said, her voice vibrating with an anger I couldn't yet access myself. "They're not just blind, Mark. They're actively choosing to be. This isn't just unfair. It's cruel." That night I sat at my new kitchen counter and typed out an email to my parents. I poured everything out, the years of sacrifice, the missed opportunities, the profound gutting hurt of being so casually discarded. I detailed every dollar, every bailed-out disaster, every swallowed dream, 3 pages of raw, unfiltered pain. But when I was done, my finger hovered over the send button. A tiny, foolish part of me, the part that still wanted his parents' approval, whispered that this would only make things worse, that maybe, just maybe, if I was quiet and patient, they would realize their mistake. I saved the letter in my drafts, a monument to a conversation that would never happen. I didn't know it then, but the war wasn't over. They hadn't just taken something from me. Soon, they would come for the one thing I had left. The months that followed the letter were defined by a heavy, ringing silence. I didn't reach out and neither did they. It was a quiet confirmation of my exile. I threw myself into my new life, a refugee seeking asylum from his own family. My house became my sanctuary. I painted the walls, a calm, steady gray. I spent a weekend assembling a bookshelf. The solid feel of the wood under my hands, a satisfying counterpoint to the phantom limb ache of my severed family ties. For the first time, I wasn't saving for a crisis or plugging a financial hole. I was building something for myself. On Sarah's advice, I started seeing a therapist, a kind, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Albright. In her quiet office, surrounded by the scent of old books and brewing tea, I began to unpack 35 years of baggage. I learned new words like enmeshment and parentification. I saw that my role as the fixer wasn't a noble calling. It was a dysfunctional one that had enabled David's perpetual immaturity and allowed my parents to abdicate their own responsibilities. "You weren't born sensible, Mark," Dr. Albright told me in our third session. "You were trained to be. There's a difference." I started making small deliberate choices that were entirely my own. I bought a piece of art, a swirling abstract of blues and greens, and hung it in my living room. I adopted a clumsy, lovable retriever mix from the local shelter and named him Sam. The quiet mornings on my porch sipping coffee with Sam's head in my lap were a world away from the chaotic, anxiety-fueled breakfasts of my childhood. The first test of my new resolve came on a Tuesday afternoon. My phone buzzed and my mother's name flashed on the screen. A familiar knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I let it ring 3 times, took a deep breath and answered. Her voice was sugary sweet, a tone she always used before making a request. "Mark, darling. How are you?" "I'm okay, Mom. What's up?" "Well, it's David. His car broke down, the poor thing, and he has a very important job interview tomorrow across town. He was just wondering, could he possibly borrow your car for a few days? And maybe if you could spare it, help with the repair bill. He's just so stressed." The Mark of 6 months ago would have said yes without a second thought. But as I stood there in my own kitchen, looking at the life I was building, I felt a new strength solidify in my spine. My heart was pounding a frantic drum against my ribs, but my voice was steady. "I'm sorry, Mom. I can't lend out my car right now, and my finances are tight." Silence. The sweetness in her voice curdled. "Oh," she said, the single word dripping with ice. "I see. Some things never change." She hung up. I stood there for a full minute, phone in hand, my body trembling. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. I had held a boundary. The cold disapproval in her voice hurt, but the surge of self-respect that followed was a revelation. A few weeks later, while organizing old financial records for Dr. Albright, I stumbled upon something strange. Tucked into a folder of old tax returns was a faded carbon copy receipt from a decade ago. It was for a wire transfer of $15,000 from my parents' joint account to a company I'd never heard of, Apex Solutions Group. The date was right around the time of David's first spectacular business failure, the one that had cost me my internship money. The sum was far larger than I had ever been told. I had given them $3,000. Where had this other money come from and where had it gone? It was a puzzle piece that didn't fit a loose thread in the family narrative. I photographed it with my phone and put it aside, a sense of unease prickling my skin. Life settled back into its quiet rhythm. Then on a sunny Saturday afternoon, the fragile piece was shattered. A car. I didn't recognize a late-model sedan that was nicer than anything my parents had ever owned, pulled into my driveway. My parents and David got out. My stomach plummeted. They hadn't called. They hadn't texted. They just appeared like a storm gathering on the horizon. I met them on the porch, Sam growling softly beside me. My mother's face was a mask of strained politeness. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. David looked bored and resentful, as if being there was an imposition. "Mark, we need to talk." My mother began skipping any pleasantries. "What is it?" I asked, my voice flat. "It's David," she said, her voice starting to tremble. "His business, the one you co-signed the loan for, it's failed. The creditors are calling nonstop. They're threatening to put a lien on our house, the house they had given him." The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. My father finally spoke, his voice, a low mumble directed at his shoes. "Son, we've been thinking you have this big house all to yourself. David, your mother, and we might need to move in with you just until David gets back on his feet." I stared at them speechless. The sheer unmitigated goal of it was staggering. "Let me get this straight," I said slowly, the words tasting like poison. "You gave David the family home, cutting me out completely. Now that he's about to lose it, you want to move into my house?" My mother's face hardened. The victim act vanished, replaced by righteous indignation. "It's the least you can do. You have so much and your brother has nothing. You have to share. We're family," she wailed, dragging out the word like a weapon. David, who had been silent, finally chimed in with a smirk. "Don't be selfish, Mark. It's a big house." That's when something inside me broke, not with a crash, but with a quiet cold snap. The part of me that had always craved their approval, that had bent and broken itself for their sake, simply withered and died. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it echoed with the weight of years of silent resentment. "No, this is my house. I worked for it. I sacrificed for it. The discussion is over. Don't take that tone with your mother." My father snapped, finally finding his voice. "You are being selfish." My mother shrieked. "You're tearing this family apart with your negativity." "Tearing it apart?" I asked, a real incredulous laugh escaping my lips. "You tore it apart when you wrote that letter. Now, please get off my property." They stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. I was no longer the fixer. I was a stranger. They left, sputtering with rage, their nice sedan peeling out of my driveway. My mother's final words, shouted through the open window, hung in the air. "You'll regret this, Mark. You'll be hearing from our lawyer. You owe us this." I thought it was an empty threat, a final dramatic salvo in a lifetime of emotional warfare. I was wrong. A week later, a certified letter arrived. Inside was a formal notice from a law firm I didn't know. My parents and David were suing me. They were demanding a controlling interest in my house. The legal basis was so twisted, so diabolical, it took my breath away. They were citing the small inheritance I had received from my grandmother years ago, the one I'd been pressured into investing in David's first failed business. They claimed it was a familial seed fund for my future, and they had a document, a notarized statement I vaguely remembered signing when I was 20, thinking it was just a formality for the inheritance distribution. They had presented it as a simple acknowledgement of receiving the funds. Now their lawyer was arguing that its vague manipulative phrasing, phrases like "in consideration of family support and for the future benefit of the family unit," implied that any significant asset I acquired was to be considered shared family property. I sank onto my kitchen floor. The letter in my hand, the paper felt like it was burning my skin. It wasn't about a house anymore. It was about ownership of my life. This was their final solution. If I wouldn't be their fixer, They would simply take everything I had fixed for myself. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a declaration of war from my own blood. The last thread of filial loyalty snapped with an audible crack in my soul. I picked up my phone, my fingers trembling so hard I could barely dial. Sarah answered on the first ring. "They're suing me," I whispered, my voice breaking. "They're suing me for my house." After I explained, she was silent for a beat, then swore with a ferocity that startled me. "That document is fraudulent, Mark. It was signed under duress, under false pretenses. That's what this is." Her anger was a life raft. It cut through my despair and left something else in its place. Cold hard resolve. They want a fight. They'll get one. I pulled up the draft of the email I had written months ago, the one filled with hurt and pleas for understanding. I deleted it, all of it. Then I started a new one. It was short, cold, and factual. It recounted their demands, the lawsuit, and the years of financial support. The last line was simple. "I have retained legal counsel to handle this matter. Do not contact me directly again." My finger didn't hesitate. I hit send. There was no turning back now. The law office of Mr. Evans was exactly what you'd expect. Dark wood, leather-bound books, and the quiet imposing scent of old paper and serious money. Mr. Evans himself was a stark contrast to his surroundings. He was a man in his late 50s with a calm demeanor and eyes that missed nothing. He listened patiently as I laid out the entire sordid history, my voice cracking at times, my hands clenched in my lap. I slid the legal notice and a copy of the notarized document they were using across his Polish desk. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. "This is a predatory claim, Mark," he said, finally, his voice even. "It's designed to bully you into submission. The document is their main weapon, but its origins are suspect. They are banking on the fact that you will fold rather than face the emotional and financial cost of fighting your own family in court." He looked at me over the top of his glasses. "Are you prepared to fight?" "Yes," I said, the word feeling more solid and real than anything I'd said in years. "I'm done folding." "Good," he nodded. "Then our first step is to dismantle their narrative. We need to prove a pattern of financial exploitation and emotional duress." The weeks that followed were a grim education. I became an archaeologist of my own life, digging through dusty boxes of old bank statements, credit card bills, and emails. Each receipt for a loan to David, each email from my mother minimizing his failures while pressuring me for cash was a piece of evidence. I forwarded them all to Mr. Evans, each click of the mouse a small act of rebellion. The work was draining, forcing me to relive every concession, every capitulation. But with each piece of proof I felt less like a victim and more like a strategist. During my search, I found it again, the faded carbon copy of the $15,000 wire transfer to Apex Solutions Group. On a gut feeling, I sent a picture of it to Mr. Evans with a note. This was from around the time of David's first big failure. I was told he only needed $3,000, which I gave them. "I don't know what this is," Mr. Evans replied within the hour. "This is interesting. Let me do some digging." Just as I was starting to feel a flicker of control, the family grapevine, that toxic and inescapable network, began to churn. My Aunt Patty, my mother's estranged sister, messaged me on social media. Her first message had been tentative, but this one was urgent. "Mark, I heard about the lawsuit has gone too far. Your mother was always blinded by David, but this has his fingerprints all over it in a way that's more than just her usual coddling. There's a desperation there. We need to talk properly." We met in a quiet anonymous coffee shop halfway between our homes. Aunt Patty looked older than I remembered, her face etched with a sadness I was just beginning to understand. She had been exiled long before I was, and I suddenly felt a kinship with this woman. "I barely knew your mother and I stopped speaking 17 years ago." She began stirring her tea with trembling hands. "It was because of David. He was 21, involved in some can't-miss tech venture and missed big time. He didn't just lose their investment. He got tangled up with some very unsavory people. He almost bankrupted them." She looked me straight in the eye. "I told your mother, Susan, let him face it. Let him learn. I told your father to be a man and put his foot down, but they wouldn't. They mortgaged their future to bail him out. And in doing so, they taught him the most dangerous lesson of all, that there are no consequences for him, that he could always manipulate them." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But it was worse than that, Mark. A few weeks after the whole mess, Susan called me hysterical. She confessed that David had threatened them. He told them if they didn't bail him out and keep bankrolling him, he would expose how they'd been cutting corners on their taxes for years to give him seed money for his earlier schemes. How your father had been fudging his small business accounts. David didn't just ask for their help. He blackmailed them for it. They've been walking on eggshells ever since, terrified of him. He learned to weaponize their fear and their foolish pride." The air left my lungs. It all clicked into place. Their fear, their frantic need to keep David happy, Their willingness to sacrifice me, the one son who couldn't hurt them, to appease the one who could. As I was processing this bombshell, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Mr. Evans. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. Subject: Apex Solutions Group. Mark, I did some digging. Apex Solutions Group was a shell corporation flagged in connection with a minor investment fraud scheme that was investigated back in 2008. No major charges were ever filed, suggesting a quiet settlement was likely reached. It seems David wasn't just bailed out of a failed business. He was extricated from a potentially criminal situation. The $15,000 payment was likely hush money paid to silence someone or make a legal problem disappear. This is more than just family drama. We have leverage. I read the email twice. Aunt Patty's story and Mr. Evans' discovery were two halves of the same ugly truth. I felt a wave of nausea followed by a strange, chilling clarity. My parents weren't just weak, they were compromised. And my brother was a predator who fed on his own family. The lawsuit wasn't just an act of greed. It was an act of desperation by people who had long ago lost control. The settlement meeting was held in Mr. Evans' conference room. The air was thick with unspoken hostility. My parents sat on one side of the long mahogany table. Their lawyer, a smug-looking man named Peterson, beside them. David was there, looking bored and entitled. My Uncle Joe, ever the loyal foot soldier, sat slightly behind them for moral support. I sat opposite them with Mr. Evans beside me. I met my mother's gaze. There was no warmth in her eyes, only a flinty resolve. Peterson began, his voice smooth and condescending. He spoke of family duty, of the spirit of the law, of the clear intent of the document I had signed as a naive young man. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, a performance of aggrieved motherhood she had perfected over decades. When he was finished, Mr. Evans calmly began his rebuttal. He laid out my years of financial support, presenting copies of checks and bank transfers. He showed them David's wheedling texts and my parents' manipulative emails. With every piece of evidence, I saw a flicker of doubt in Peterson's eyes. My parents and David just looked increasingly angry. This is a distortion. My mother cried out. He's our son. He should want to help us. He has to share his house. It's the only Christian thing to do. Mr. Evans held up a hand, stopping her. He stood slowly, a silent command for attention. Actually, Mrs. Miller, he doesn't, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. And given the rather irregular financial activities surrounding your son David's past business ventures, specifically pertaining to a company named Apex Solutions Group around 2008, and certain documented pressures he has exerted on you, perhaps pressing this matter further would invite a level of scrutiny that none of you would welcome. He let the words hang in the air. He slid a folder across the table. It contained copies of my mother's distress letters to Aunt Patty and a printout of the public information about the Apex Solutions Group fraud investigation. He didn't accuse them of anything directly. He didn't have to. The implication was a nuclear bomb in the center of the table. The color drained from my parents' faces. My father looked like he might actually be sick. My mother stared at David, her expression one of pure unadulterated terror. David's smug mask shattered, replaced by raw panic. Even Uncle Joe looked utterly bewildered, finally sensing he was a pawn in a much darker game than he understood. Mr. Evans pressed his advantage, his voice like cold steel. My client is prepared to drop this matter entirely. He will walk away and seek no damages for this frivolous and malicious lawsuit. In return, you will sign a full and final release of all claims on him and his property, and you will agree to cease all contact unless initiated by him through counsel. This is not a negotiation. He glanced at his watch. You have 1 hour to decide, but I suggest you take 5 minutes. The fight was over. They knew it, and I knew it. There was nowhere left for them to hide. The silence that followed Mr. Evans's ultimatum was heavier than any argument. It was the sound of a dynasty of dysfunction collapsing under its own weight. Peterson, the smug lawyer, was now pale, whispering frantically to my parents. David stared at the documents on the table as if they were venomous snakes. My mother looked back and forth between David and my father, her face a mess of panic and betrayal. The protector and the enabler were finally seeing the true cost of their bargain. It didn't take an hour. It barely took 5 minutes. Their whispered, frantic conference ended with a defeated slump in my father's shoulders. Peterson cleared his throat, his earlier confidence completely gone. My clients are prepared to agree to your terms, Mr. Evans nodded crisply and produced the settlement papers he had prepared in advance. He laid them out on the table along with 2 pens. Sign here and here, he said, his voice devoid of triumph, purely professional. The scratching of their pens was the only sound in the room. David signed first, his hand moving in a jerky, angry scrawl. My father's signature was shaky, the signature of a defeated man. My mother was last. Her hand trembled. As she put the pen down, she looked at me, her eyes swimming with tears of rage and self-pity. Mark, she whispered, her voice trembling. How could you do this to your own? I didn't let her finish. I stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor. I looked directly at her, not with the anger that had fueled me for weeks, but with a strange glacial calm. To my own family? I interrupted, my voice steady. The real question, Mother, is how could you? For years, this is over. I turned and walked out of the conference room without a backward glance. I didn't need to see them one last time. I didn't need to hear another word. As the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the cool, sterile air of the hallway felt like the first clean breath I had taken in my entire life. The aftermath was not dramatic. It was quiet. The silence from my family, which had once been a punishment, was now a gift. The anger that had been a constant fire in my gut for months slowly cooled, leaving behind not emptiness, but a profound and welcome peace. Sarah was overjoyed. She brought over a bottle of champagne and we toasted on my crooked porch with Sam snoozing at our feet. To new beginnings, Mark, she said, her eyes shining. You did it. You really, really did it. We talked for hours, not just about my victory, but about her own small successful steps in setting boundaries with her parents. Seeing me break free had inspired her, and that felt like the most meaningful outcome of all. A few days later, I received a short email from Aunt Patty. Well done. Your grandmother would be proud. Call me sometime. I did. We talked for over an hour, two exiles finding common ground. I had found a piece of my family, a piece built on truth and respect, not obligation and fear. News of the others trickled in as it always does through the family grapevine. A neutral cousin with no agenda, but to share news, told me that the parents had to sell the family home after all. It turned out David's debts were even more extensive than they had known. They were living in a small cramped rental apartment across town. David, she'd heard, had left the state, leaving them to clean up his mess. One last time, I felt a brief, distant pang of pity for the two people in that apartment, but it was quickly replaced by the certainty that their fate was a product of their own choices. There was no triumph in their downfall, just a quiet acknowledgement of consequences. Months later, I ran into my Uncle Joe at the grocery store. He saw me in the produce aisle and his face went pale. He approached me hesitantly, wringing his hands. Mark, he started, his voice thick, about your parents. The old Mark would have listened, would have absorbed the guilt he was about to be served. The new Mark didn't. I gave him a small, polite smile that didn't reach my eyes. Uncle Joe, I said, my voice gentle but firm. My relationship with them is my own now. I hope you're well. I nodded, pushed my cart past him, and kept walking. Another boundary held. Another small, quiet victory. It's been over a year now. My house is no longer just a structure of wood and nails. It's a sanctuary. The silence that used to unnerve me is now the sound of peace. My startup idea is no longer a daydream. It's a business plan on my desk. I'm dating a wonderful woman who knows my story and respects the walls I've built around my life. Not because she wants to break them down, but because she understands why they're there. I learned that the pain was immense, but it forged something unbreakable inside me, a sense of self-worth that no one could ever sue me for. The silence from my parents was deafening at first, and then it became the soundtrack to my freedom. I learned that sometimes the most loving act for yourself is to walk away from those who refuse to see your worth. My family now is chosen, built on the solid ground of honesty and support, not the shifting sands of obligation and guilt. They tried to take my home, but in the end they gave me back my life.